I question the dating of the pyramids. I think, it's a difficult thing to say purely because you're looking at the skeletal remains of something that's probably been worked on and renovated and reused and just. I'm sure the dynastic Egyptians were working on these things. They did things to them. They used them. They became part of their culture. My problem with the pyramid, particularly the Great Pyramid, because that's the one we've studied the most, but actually most of them, obviously you have the logistical issues with the timeline that I talked about. I think these were multi-generational projects. They almost have to be. We've got tons of examples of that type of thing in our own time, how long it takes us to build, the Panama Canal or these giant projects. They're infrastructure projects. They take a long time. The problem I have with them is the precision and the knowledge that's encoded in them. Like, I think any honest analysis of the pyramids leaves you in a position where you have no choice but to reevaluate and rewrite history. You either end up, if you go, okay, the dynastic Egyptians built them, right? Fine. In that case, they had far more capability,
right,
and far more knowledge than we've ever attributed to them, right? I think I've talked before about the fact that you have the dimensions of the Earth encoded into the pyramid, right? It's essentially a scale model of the northern hemisphere. There seems to be specific information about the fact that the Earth's an oblate spheroid, that it's longer around the equatorial circumference than it is the polar circumference.
Right.
The grid of latitude and longitude, like that ratio, of the fact that we're slightly longer east to west than we are north to south. That ratio, if you knock it out on like a grid of latitude and longitude, those squares, they're not really squares, they're rectangular.
Because of the way the Earth's shaped, the latitude lines are shorter than the longitudinal lines.
Right.
So if you take a square unit basically out of the Earth starting at the equator, it would be wider than it is tall. And if you scale it down, it is like within inches, the exact size.
I have it here. Let me grab it here. Pyramid stuff. It's actually called. This is it here. So so it kind of starts here. This is where that ratio is encoded. It's in something called the socle.
Yes.
Which is essentially a cubit high. It's like a little think of it as like a little platform the pyramid sits on, which gives you two ways to measure its perimeter, right? You can measure the perimeter based on the perimeter of the socle or the perimeter of the actual pyramid. And then so this is exactly what you were talking about. So 1/4 of 1 minute of latitude at the equator on the Earth is 3,022.9 feet. Mm-hmm. A quarter of a minute of longitude is slightly longer at 43.5 feet. And then so the perimeter length of the pyramid without the socle is 0.2 of a foot off, and this is 0.1 of a foot off, being exactly that same ratio. So you have latitude and longitude. You have the dimensionality of the planet. Which is Randall mentioned this the other day. It's we didn't really get an accurate understanding of that until we had satellite surveys and we did space observations in the 1980s. And it turns out, because we had a much different idea of this before that time, and the more accurate we became, the closer we got to the pyramid numbers. You know what I'm saying? Like we've started to learn that actually the pyramid very accurately encodes this data. You have some other things on the pyramid, like it has that ratio of 4:3:2. This is one of those cosmically significant numbers that's in that pantheon of very interesting astronomical numbers, and it's at a scale of 43,200. It essentially replicates the Earth. You multiply the height of the Great Pyramid by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. You multiply the base perimeter of it by 42,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth.
This was coming up a lot yesterday with Randall when he was explaining this plasmoid generator type thing and how the dimensions of the tubes and the sphere and the thunderbolt generator it starts at 4 inches, then it goes to 3, then it goes to 2. Yeah. That is used like throughout that whole mechanism, which is...
Yeah, there's a lot of these numbers tend to repeat in lots of different ways, and Randall's a complete master at showing it all. But that's why I say that I think, other people have argued that the speed of light's encoded in it, and there's obviously all this precision stonework in the pyramid. So, it's a logistical achievement like no other that wasn't equaled until relatively modern times. I mean, so I think under either case, so either the dynastic Egyptians built it or they didn't, right? So you have to, it's either one or the other. But if you go with they did, then we need to reevaluate and rewrite history based on what it means and what information they have and their capabilities. And we vastly underestimated the dynastic Egyptians. They were far more capable, and where did they get this data from and how did they know it? Like, that's a rewrite of history. And if they didn't make it, like, they for sure worked on it, but if there was something else here and this inspired them, then that's another picture. Like, who did then? Like, so that's where you get to this concept of inheritance. And and this is why I'm a supporter of the lost ancient civilization hypothesis, is that I think the vast majority of evidence favors that answer. I just think there is so much evidence of renovation and reuse and imitation. I think it's like I'd look at dynastic Egypt, and I think this idea of them being basically a giant cargo cult, the world's most advanced cargo cult, makes a lot of sense, because you got to imagine the other problem with the pyramids is that, you know, these are the first pyramids that were ever made, right? They're like, that's at the very pointy end. It's
the first ones were the best ones.
The first ones were the best ones. Right. Yeah, the step pyramid's another story. I think that is dynastic. But then immediately after the step pyramid, you have these mighty, gigantic stone pyramids that were supposedly constructed. But they kept making pyramids after that. I mean, take a look at this. Like, so, you know, it's to me, it's why I get this term, a tale of two industries. You have the earliest pyramids of these giant stone structures that are still standing today. They kept building pyramids right through the Middle Kingdom, but they were making them from mud brick, and they were much smaller, and they were much less sophisticated. And they're today eroding away slowly because this is how they were made. It's like this technology just disappeared if they had it. And then they were trying to imitate these other pieces of these other works with mud bricks. And in fact, this is also supported, this primitive methodology is supported by scenes on the wall. Like, there is a scene of pyramid building, but it's mud bricks. It's in the Tomb of the Nobles on the west bank of the Nile.
How did they make the mud bricks?
Well, they'd put together these theyey'd bake them in the sun, or they might have baked them in ovens, and they'd make these big mud bricks, and then they'd transport them to, you know, it's like straw or hay and mud, and you bake it, and you stick it in a mold, and you cook it. Geopolymer, people, it's probably what it is. It's a form of geopolymer. And then they'd stack them up, and they'd build it that way. And it's a process that continues to this day, people doing stuff that way. But that's how they built them. And so what's interesting to me is that this concept that, you know, there's an advanced version of a particular thing, pyramids is one of them, and a primitive version of a particular thing that matches the tools and techniques that we know about. Right? We know that they were relatively primitive. They didn't use the wheel. They used manpower. They used primitive tools like flint chisels and pounding stones and, you know, wooden implements for this sort of stuff. And there's scenes on the wall that support it, right? So they showed us how they did it. That exact set of circumstances exists not only for pyramids, but it exists for vases, for columns, for boxes, for slabs. There's an advanced and then there's a primitive version of that, and I've been slowly trying to document that in detail over the last couple of years and look at each category of these and say, okay, so what matches the tools that we know they could use and the techniques that we know that they used and the stuff they drew on the walls that showed us how they did it versus the stuff that isn't explainable via those mechanisms. And so that's why I think when you look at these advanced things and you look at what the dynastic Egyptians were doing, and you look at their own history and what they say about their past, all of a sudden this idea of inheritance, you know, and a longer timeline, the fact that maybe they got a kickstart, you know, when they finally came out of that Neolithic or Mesolithic Stone Age and they began civilization, they had enough people and they could organize and they might have started with all of these artifacts and objects.